"Wait outside, old man." The words came sharp and cold, loud enough for everyone standing near the courthouse entrance to hear. Walter Coleman stopped with one hand resting on the handle of his worn leather briefcase. His silver hair caught the morning sunlight, and behind his thin-rimmed glasses, his eyes remained remarkably calm. He looked at the officer standing in front of him. "Excuse me?" Walter asked. Officer Scott Rawlings stepped closer and glanced at the briefcase before looking Walter up and down. "You heard me. Visitors wait outside until they're called in." Walter looked through the glass doors behind the officer. People were walking freely into the courthouse. Lawyers in suits, clerks carrying folders, court employees wearing identification badges. Walter quietly pointed toward the entrance. "I have business inside." Rawlings gave a short laugh. "Everybody who gets stopped says that." Walter reached into his coat and pulled out his identification. He handed it over without saying another word. Rawlings looked at it, then looked back at Walter. His expression barely changed. "This doesn't tell me why you're here." "It tells you who I am," Walter replied. "That's not what I asked." Walter studied the officer for a moment. There was no anger in his voice when he answered. "Then perhaps you should ask the right question." Rawlings' jaw tightened. "Don't get smart with me." Walter said nothing. He simply adjusted his glasses. A young courthouse employee approaching the entrance noticed Walter and suddenly slowed down. She recognized him. Before she could say anything, Rawlings raised a hand. "Keep moving." The woman hesitated, glanced at Walter, then quietly walked inside. Walter watched her disappear through the doors. Rawlings folded his arms. "You can wait over there." He pointed toward a bench several yards away. Walter looked at the bench, then at the courthouse clock. "For how long?" "Until I tell you otherwise." Walter took a slow breath. He could have argued. He could have demanded a supervisor. He could have reminded the officer that he had every right to enter the building. Instead, he simply walked toward the bench and sat down. Rawlings smiled as if he had won. He had no idea what Walter was doing. He had no idea why Walter wasn't angry. And most importantly, he had no idea that the quiet man sitting beneath the courthouse awning had spent decades inside courtrooms, listening carefully while people revealed far more than they intended. Walter opened his briefcase, removed a small notebook, and wrote down 3 things: the officer's name, the exact time, and the words he had just heard. Then Walter closed the notebook and looked through the courthouse doors. Scott Rawlings still believed he was dealing with an old man who had nowhere else to go. Walter Coleman knew better. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most important thing you can do when someone underestimates you is let them keep talking. "You can sit there all morning, old man. I'm the one who decides when you come inside." Scott Rawlings said it with the confidence of someone who believed the courthouse doors belonged to him. Walter Coleman slowly lifted his eyes from the notebook resting on his knee. He had already written down the time, the officer's name, and the exact words Rawlings had used. He closed the notebook and placed it back inside his briefcase. "Officer Rawlings," Walter said calmly, "I believe I've waited long enough." Rawlings glanced at his watch. "You've been here 11 minutes. "That's correct." "Then wait 11 more." Walter looked through the glass doors. People continued entering the courthouse without being questioned. A man in a navy suit walked past Rawlings while talking on his phone. 2 women carrying folders stepped inside. A delivery driver entered without stopping. Walter watched all of them, then looked back at the officer. "Am I being detained?" Rawlings' expression changed slightly. "Don't make this complicated. I asked a simple question. You're not going anywhere until I'm satisfied." Walter adjusted his glasses. "Satisfied with what?" Rawlings stepped toward the bench and lowered his voice. "You show up here alone, carrying a briefcase, refusing to explain why you're here, and expecting me to just let you walk inside." Walter almost smiled. "I did explain. You said you have business. Inside." "That is correct." "What kind of business?" Walter paused. "Private." Rawlings shook his head. "See? That attitude is exactly the problem." Walter looked at him carefully. "What attitude?" "The attitude that you think the rules don't apply to you." For the first time, Walter's expression became slightly more serious. "Officer, I have never said that." "You don't have to." Rawlings pointed toward the briefcase. "Open it." Walter remained seated. Why? Because I asked you to. That isn't a reason. Rawlings looked around, making sure several people nearby could hear him. If there's nothing to hide, you shouldn't have a problem. Walter took another slow breath. He had heard that argument countless times during his years in courtrooms. It sounded simple, but it was never as simple as people pretended. Officer Rawlings, he said, you may want to be very careful about what you ask me to do. Rawlings scoffed. Is that a threat? No, Walter looked directly at him. It's advice. Rawlings reached for his radio, clearly irritated now. I'm calling my supervisor. Walter nodded. Please do. That answer caught Rawlings off guard. He expected resistance. He expected anger. Instead, Walter seemed almost relieved. Rawlings turned away and spoke quietly into his radio. Walter opened his notebook again. This time, he added one more line. Then he looked toward the courthouse doors. A clerk standing inside had been watching the entire exchange. When their eyes met, the clerk quietly disappeared down a hallway. Walter noticed. Rawlings did not. The officer believed he was tightening control over the situation. He didn't realize that every new demand was creating another record of what had happened that morning. And somewhere inside that courthouse, people were beginning to understand that Walter Coleman wasn't simply waiting to be allowed inside. He was waiting for Scott Rawlings to make one mistake too many. Open the briefcase, or I'll make sure you regret refusing. Scott Rawlings' voice carried across the courthouse entrance, and several people nearby turned to look. Walter Coleman remained seated, his silver hair perfectly still, his glasses resting low on the bridge of his nose. He looked at the officer for a long moment before answering. You've already made your position clear. Rawlings frowned. Then you understand what happens next. Walter calmly placed his notebook inside the briefcase and closed it. No, officer, I understand what you want to happen next. That answer irritated Rawlings more than any argument could have. Stand up. Walter slowly rose. Why? Because I said so. Walter looked toward the courthouse doors. Am I being detained? Rawlings hesitated for half a second. Not yet. Then I'm free to enter the courthouse. Walter took one step toward the entrance. Rawlings moved in front of him. I told you to wait. Walter stopped. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch the officer. He simply looked at him through his glasses. Then please tell me the lawful reason. Rawlings stared at him. You really like asking questions, don't you? Questions are useful when answers matter. A few feet away, a young clerk stood near the glass doors, watching carefully. Another employee had started recording the interaction on a phone. Rawlings noticed the attention and became more formal. Sir, I am conducting a security inquiry. Based on what? Based on circumstances. Walter almost smiled. What circumstances? Rawlings pointed toward Walter's briefcase. That. A briefcase is a circumstance. Don't play games with me. Walter sighed quietly. I'm not playing anything. Rawlings stepped back and spoke in his radio. Dispatch, I need a supervisor at the main entrance. Then he looked at Walter. You're going to wait right here until someone gets here. Walter nodded. Understood. Rawlings seemed satisfied. He turned away, believing he had finally forced Walter into submission. But Walter sat back down and opened the briefcase. Inside was a neatly organized stack of legal documents. At the top was a folder marked with a case number. Walter removed it, checked the first page, and then put it back. The clerk inside the courthouse watched him do it. Her expression changed. She recognized the case number. She looked toward Walter again, then quickly picked up the phone behind the reception desk. Yes, she whispered. He's here. Walter heard none of the conversation, or at least, he gave no indication that he did. Rawlings, meanwhile, paced near the entrance, checking his radio and occasionally glancing back at the old man. He seemed increasingly confident that the situation was under control. Then a supervisor finally appeared through the courthouse doors. He walked straight toward Rawlings, but before saying anything, he looked past him at Walter Coleman. The supervisor's face went pale. Officer Rawlings, he said carefully, do you know who that is? Rawlings glanced back at Walter. Some guy who refuses to cooperate. The supervisor stared at him for several seconds. Then he lowered his voice. You need to rethink that answer. Walter slowly closed his briefcase. For the first time that morning, he looked almost amused. Scott Rawlings had spent nearly 30 minutes treating Walter Coleman like someone who had no authority, no influence, and nowhere else to go. He was about to discover that the quiet man on the bench had been given far more power inside that courthouse than Rawlings could possibly imagine. You need to rethink that answer, Officer Rawlings. The supervisor's quiet words changed the atmosphere around the courthouse entrance. Scott Rawlings turned toward him with a confused expression. What's that supposed to mean? The supervisor glanced at Walter Coleman again. Walter was still seated on the bench, his leather briefcase resting beside him, his silver hair neat, and his glasses catching the morning light. It means you should stop talking for a moment. Rawlings frowned. I was told there was a security concern. By whom? Me. The supervisor stared at him. And what exactly is the concern? Rawlings pointed toward Walter. He refused to explain why he was here. He refused to open his briefcase. He refused several instructions. Walter quietly corrected him. I answered every question you asked me. Rawlings turned sharply. Nobody asked you. Walter said nothing. The supervisor looked uncomfortable. Officer Rawlings, did you ask him whether he was authorized to enter? I asked him what his business was. That wasn't my question. Rawlings paused. No. The supervisor looked toward Walter. Mr. Coleman, have you been denied entry? Walter nodded. Yes. For how long? Walter checked his watch. 38 minutes. The supervisor's expression tightened. Rawlings immediately interrupted. Sir, I was only trying to make sure. I understand what you were trying to do. The supervisor looked at him. The question is whether you had a reason to do it. Rawlings crossed his arms. I had concerns. Based on, Rawlings looked toward Walter's briefcase. His behavior. Walter raised an eyebrow. My behavior? You were evasive. I told you I had private business inside. Exactly. The supervisor rubbed his forehead. That's not suspicious by itself. Rawlings seemed frustrated that the conversation was no longer going his way. Then he noticed the young clerk standing several feet away. Did you know this man before today? He asked her. The clerk hesitated. Yes. Ow, I've seen him here before. As what? She looked at Walter. Walter gave her a small nod, almost as if telling her she didn't need to answer. The supervisor noticed the exchange. Officer, step inside with me. Rawlings didn't move. But the situation isn't resolved. It is for now. What about him? Rawlings pointed toward Walter. The supervisor looked at Walter again. Mr. Coleman can go wherever he needs to go. Rawlings stared at him. Why? The supervisor took a breath. Because he has every right to be here. Walter stood slowly and picked up his briefcase. He walked toward the courthouse doors, passing Scott Rawlings without saying a word. Rawlings watched him disappear inside. Something about the supervisor's reaction bothered him. He pulled out his phone and checked the time. Then he noticed the security camera mounted above the entrance. His eyes stayed on it for several seconds. Is that camera recording? He asked. The supervisor didn't answer immediately. Yes. Rawlings swallowed. How long are the recordings kept? Long enough. Walter had already reached the hallway when he stopped. He looked back through the glass doors. He could see Scott Rawlings standing beneath the camera, staring at it. Their eyes met. Walter simply adjusted his glasses and continued walking. Rawlings had finally realized something important. The courthouse had been watching. And now, so was everyone else. You should have walked away when you had the chance. Scott Rawlings said the words quietly, almost as if he were giving Walter Coleman one final warning. Walter stopped in the courthouse hallway and slowly turned around. I believe you're the one who should be reconsidering your choices, officer. Rawlings followed him inside, ignoring the supervisor's earlier instruction to remain at the entrance. He seemed determined to regain control of the situation. I still have questions, he said. Walter looked at him through his glasses, then asked them, what's in the briefcase? Documents. What documents? Legal documents. Rawlings gave a frustrated sigh. You keep answering without actually answering. Walter calmly replied. You keep asking questions that you have no reason to ask. A few people in the hallway had stopped to watch. Rawlings noticed them and lowered his voice. I don't like your attitude. Walter smiled faintly. That is becoming very clear. The officer stepped closer, but stopped when the supervisor called from behind him. Rawlings. The tone was firm. Enough. Rawlings turned around. I'm doing my job. Then do it properly. Rawlings looked back at Walter. Fine. I'll document everything. Walter nodded. Please do. That answer seemed to irritate him even more. You think this is funny? No, Walter held his briefcase at his side. I think it is important. Important? Yes. Because when people write things down, they sometimes forget that someone else may eventually read them. Rawlings stared at him. Are you threatening me again? No. I'm reminding you that records have a way of outliving conversations. Walter turned and continued down the hallway. Rawlings watched him go, then pulled out his phone and began typing. Within minutes, he had drafted his version of what happened that morning. He described Walter as uncooperative. He wrote that Walter had refused reasonable instructions. He wrote that Walter had behaved suspiciously. And then he added one sentence that would become far more important than he realized. Subject was unwilling to provide a clear explanation for his presence. Rawlings submitted the report and leaned back with a satisfied expression. As far as he was concerned, the situation was finished. What he didn't know was that Walter had already asked the courthouse clerk to preserve the entrance footage from 8:10 a.m. to 9:35 a.m. He also didn't know that another camera had captured the hallway conversation. Most importantly, he didn't know that Walter had not come to the courthouse that morning simply to attend a hearing. Walter entered a quiet conference room at the end of the hall and placed his briefcase on the table. He opened it and removed the same folder he had looked at earlier. On the cover was a case number, a date, and several official documents. Walter studied the first page, then picked up his phone. Maya, he said when the call connected. I need you to come to the courthouse. There was a brief pause on the other end. Walter continued. Bring the file we discussed yesterday. His expression remained calm. And Maya, make sure nobody deletes the footage from this morning. He ended the call and closed the folder. Outside the room, Scott Rawlings was still convinced that he had written the final word on the incident. He had no idea that Walter Coleman had just made sure his version would be compared, line by line, with the truth. By the time Scott Rawlings realized who Walter Coleman was, his report had already been submitted. Maya's voice came through the phone, calm but serious. Walter sat across from her in a quiet courthouse conference room, his silver hair neatly combed, his glasses resting comfortably on his face. The leather briefcase sat open on the table between them. Did you bring everything? Walter asked. Maya placed a thick folder beside his. Everything you requested. And there's something else. Walter looked up. What? The courthouse preserved the entrance footage. Walter nodded. Good. Maya opened her folder. There are 3 cameras covering the area where you were stopped. 1 records the main entrance. 1 covers the hallway. The 3rd captures part of the security desk. Walter leaned back in his chair. And the officer's report? Maya slid a printed copy across the table. Exactly what you expected. Walter read the first few lines without changing expression. He says I refused to cooperate. Yes. He says I was evasive. Yes. And he says I couldn't explain why I was there. Maya looked at him. You told him several times. Walter closed the report. Then the footage will speak for itself. Maya studied him for a moment. Walter, there's something you should know. Go ahead. Scott Rawlings has written reports like this before. Walter's expression became more serious. How many? Enough that I think this morning may be part of a larger problem. She opened another folder. Inside were copies of several complaints, each involving different people and different dates. Walter looked through them slowly. Were these investigated? Some were reviewed. Most were closed. Why? Insufficient evidence. Conflicting accounts. Lack of witnesses. Walter looked up. And now? Maya pointed toward the courthouse cameras. Now, there is video. Walter nodded. That changes everything. At that moment, someone knocked on the conference room door. The courthouse supervisor stepped inside. Mr. Coleman, may I speak with you? Walter stood. Of course. The supervisor glanced at Maya before looking directly at Walter. I owe you an apology. Walter said nothing. What happened at the entrance should never have happened, the supervisor continued. Officer Rawlings was not authorized to keep you outside that long. Walter calmly replied, I understand. There's another matter. What is it? The supervisor hesitated. He has already told several officers that you were difficult and possibly trying to interfere with courthouse operations. Maya immediately looked toward Walter. Walter remained calm. Has he seen the footage? Not yet. Then let him keep talking. The supervisor looked surprised. You aren't angry? Walter adjusted his glasses. Anger doesn't improve evidence. Maya smiled faintly. That sounds like the Walter Coleman I remember. The supervisor looked at him carefully. May I ask why you were here today? Walter paused. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he closed the folder in front of him. I was asked to review a matter involving the police department. The supervisor's eyes widened slightly. An internal review? Something along those lines. Maya looked at Walter. We should probably head upstairs. Walter picked up his briefcase. Yes. As they walked toward the courtroom, Scott Rawlings was standing near the entrance, speaking confidently with another officer. He glanced up and saw Walter approaching. His expression changed immediately. But instead of stepping aside, Rawlings straightened his uniform and said, There he is. Walter stopped. Rawlings looked at Maya, then back at him. So, what exactly is your business here, Mr. Coleman? Walter smiled politely. You're about to find out. Then he walked past him. Scott Rawlings watched him disappear through the courtroom doors, unaware that the man he had treated like an inconvenience was about to become the most important witness in the case he thought he controlled. You want to know why I was here, Officer Rawlings? Now everyone is going to know. Walter Coleman's voice was calm as he stood inside the courtroom. Scott Rawlings sat several rows away, his earlier confidence noticeably fading. The room was quieter than usual. At the front, Judge Michael Sterling reviewed the documents placed before him while Maya Richardson organized several folders on the table. Rawlings leaned toward the officer beside him and whispered, What is this? The other officer didn't answer. Judge Sterling looked toward the clerk. Are we ready to proceed? Yes, Your Honor. Walter took his seat. He did not look at Rawlings. Maya stood and placed a document on the table. Your Honor, before we address the original matter, we would like to submit a preservation request and supporting evidence concerning an incident that occurred at the courthouse entrance this morning. Rawlings immediately raised his hand. Your Honor, I can explain that. Judge Sterling looked at him. You will have an opportunity to respond. Rawlings lowered his hand. Maya continued. Officer Rawlings submitted a written report describing Mr. Coleman as uncooperative and suspicious. She placed the report before the judge. However, the courthouse security system captured the entire interaction. A monitor was turned toward the courtroom. Rawlings shifted in his chair. The first recording began. His own voice filled the room. Wait outside, old man. The courtroom became completely silent. Walter remained still. The recording continued. It showed Rawlings stopping Walter at the entrance, questioning him repeatedly, refusing to provide a clear reason for keeping him outside and demanding that he open his briefcase. Then came the moment when Walter asked, Am I being detained? Rawlings' recorded answer was unmistakable. Not yet. The video paused. Judge Sterling looked toward the officer. Is it your voice? Rawlings swallowed. Yes, Your Honor, but there was context. Maya immediately responded. There is more. The second recording began. It showed Rawlings telling Walter that he would not be allowed inside until he was satisfied. Then the third recording showed Rawlings discussing the incident with another officer. His written report had described Walter as evasive. The video showed something very different. Walter had answered every question. He had remained calm. He had never raised his voice. He had never threatened anyone. Judge Sterling turned another page. Officer Rawlings, why does your report say the subject refused to explain his presence? Rawlings looked uncomfortable. He wasn't giving me a satisfactory explanation. That isn't what I asked. Rawlings paused. I may have worded it differently. Walter finally looked toward him. You didn't word it differently. Rawlings stared at him. Maya placed another document on the table. There is also a history of similar complaints. Rawlings' expression changed. Those are unrelated. Walter spoke quietly. Are they? The judge looked at the documents. Several names appeared on the pages. Different dates. Different circumstances. Similar descriptions. Judge Sterling looked up. Mr. Coleman, why are you involved in this review? Walter slowly stood. The courtroom became silent again. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at the judge. Because I was asked to evaluate whether previous complaints were handled properly. Rawlings stared at him. Evaluate? Walter nodded. Yes. The judge leaned back. And who asked you? Walter opened the final folder. The State Judicial Oversight Committee. Rawlings' face went pale. Walter continued. And after what happened this morning, I believe we have considerably more to examine than we expected. Scott Rawlings had spent the entire morning believing he was questioning an old man. Now he was sitting in a courtroom while that same man reviewed the evidence against him. And for the first time, Rawlings understood the mistake he had made. He hadn't stopped a nobody at the courthouse entrance. He had stopped the person who had been brought there to examine the very system he believed would always protect him. The video proved what happened this morning. The records will prove it was not an isolated incident. Walter Coleman's words fell across the courtroom, and Scott Rawlings suddenly stopped looking at the floor. Maya Richardson placed another folder in front of Judge Michael Sterling. Your Honor, these are the complaints we mentioned earlier. The judge opened the first file. How many? 7 complaints involving Officer Rawlings over the past 4 years, Maya answered. Rawlings immediately stood. Those complaints were reviewed. Judge Sterling looked up. Sit down, Officer Rawlings. You will have your opportunity. Rawlings slowly sat. Walter remained at the witness table, his hands resting calmly on the leather briefcase. The judge examined the documents one by one. The first complaint involved a black man who had been stopped outside a grocery store. The second involved a black woman questioned outside an apartment complex. The third involved an older black veteran who had been ordered to wait outside a public building without a clear explanation. The details were different, but the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Judge Sterling looked toward Rawlings. Were you present during these incidents? Some of them. And were complaints filed? Yes. Were they investigated? Rawlings hesitated. To my knowledge. Maya opened another folder. The previous investigations relied heavily on the officer's written statements. Walter finally spoke. There was little independent evidence. Until now, Maya said. She placed a small drive beside the monitor. The courthouse footage gives us something those earlier cases didn't have. Judge Sterling nodded toward the clerk. Play it. The first video showed Walter sitting on the bench. The second showed Rawlings speaking with his supervisor. Then another recording appeared, this one from inside the courthouse hallway. Rawlings could be heard saying that Walter was acting suspicious and that he intended to document him as uncooperative. Judge Sterling paused the recording. Mr. Rawlings, had you completed your report at this point? Not yet, but you'd already decided how you would describe him? Rawlings looked down. I was going to report what I observed. Walter adjusted his glasses. That is precisely the issue. Rawlings looked at him. You don't know anything about police work. Walter remained calm. No, but I know something about evidence. The courtroom went silent. Walter opened the final folder. For 31 years, I served on the bench. I learned that a person's position does not make their statement true. Evidence does. Rawlings stared at him. The supervisor, sitting behind the prosecution table, looked increasingly uncomfortable. Walter continued. This morning, Officer Rawlings believed he could control the situation by controlling the narrative. He could decide what happened in his report. He could describe me however he wanted. But he forgot one thing. Judge Sterling looked toward him. What was that? Walter glanced at the monitor. The cameras were not working for him. A few people in the courtroom exchanged quiet looks. Rawlings shifted in his seat. He had entered the courthouse, believing his badge gave him the final word. Now every sentence he had spoken was being measured against a recording. Maya then placed one final document before the judge. There is one more matter, Your Honor. Judge Sterling looked down. His expression changed. Where did you get this? Maya answered, from departments. Internal records. Rawlings leaned forward. What is it? Maya looked directly at him. Your previous disciplinary review. Rawlings went completely still. Walter said nothing. He didn't need to. The next document was about to reveal something even Rawlings had tried to keep buried. The badge you were so proud of was never the thing that made you powerful, Officer Rawlings. It was the responsibility you were supposed to carry. Walter Coleman's words were quiet, but the courtroom heard every one of them. Scott Rawlings sat motionless as Maya Richardson placed the final document before Judge Michael Sterling. It was a disciplinary review from 2 years earlier, involving another complaint that had never received a complete independent investigation. The report contained familiar phrases: uncooperative, suspicious behavior, and failure to comply. Judge Sterling looked from the document to Rawlings. Why was this review closed? Rawlings swallowed. The department determined there wasn't enough evidence. Maya immediately placed the courthouse footage beside it. There wasn't video evidence then. There is now. The judge studied both documents. And what does the current footage establish? That the language in Officer Rawlings' report does not accurately describe what occurred. Rawlings finally stood. Your Honor, I made a judgment call. Judge Sterling's expression remained firm. A judgment call is not permission to alter facts. Rawlings looked toward Walter. You planned this. Walter shook his head. No, you made your own choices. You knew exactly who you were dealing with. Walter answered calmly. I knew only that you were a police officer who had decided to stop me from entering a public building. He paused. Everything else, you revealed yourself. The room fell silent. Judge Sterling reviewed the evidence one final time. Then he turned toward the department supervisor. Based on the footage, the written report, and the prior disciplinary record, I am referring this matter for formal administrative review and immediate consideration of suspension from field duties pending the outcome. Rawlings stared ahead. His badge, once a symbol he had, carried with complete confidence, now represented a question he could no longer avoid. The supervisor nodded. Understood, Your Honor. Rawlings looked at Walter. You could have told me who you were. Walter gave him a calm look. Would that have changed how you treated me? Rawlings said nothing. Walter continued. That's the question you should be asking yourself. The hearing moved on, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The man who had been ordered to wait outside was no longer being treated as an inconvenience. His testimony had exposed weaknesses that had existed long before he walked through those courthouse doors. And the evidence had done something Walter could never have accomplished through anger or confrontation. It had spoken for itself. As Walter left the courtroom, Maya walked beside him. Are you satisfied? She asked. Walter looked down the long courthouse hallway. Satisfied? He smiled faintly. No, but I'm hopeful. They reached the entrance where the entire situation had begun that morning. The bench was still there. The security cameras were still mounted above the doors. Walter stopped for a moment and looked at the place where he had spent nearly 40 minutes being told he didn't belong. Then he adjusted his glasses and continued outside. Behind him, Scott Rawlings remained inside, facing an investigation that could end his career. Walter never needed to shout. He never needed to threaten anyone. He simply remained calm, kept records, and allowed the truth to catch up with the person who believed he could control it. The man Rawlings had called Old Man had walked into the courthouse looking for justice. He walked out knowing that, for once, the system had listened. And somewhere behind those courthouse doors, a badge that once seemed untouchable had finally begun to lose its shine. Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of justice.